Good evening and welcome to the Married Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Sarah Sandbar and I'm one of the Ath Fellows here. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I would like to introduce a CMC alumna from the class of '98, Amy Verity. She is a ROTC grad and a veteran, and she is here to give us some information and talk a little bit about Veterans Day and our speaker.
Good evening. My name is Amy Verity, and I'm a CMC alumna. I was commissioned as an Army officer through CMC's ROTC program. It's where I met my husband. He was a CMCer and now an alum and Army veteran as well. I served 4 years on active duty, mostly in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, so it wasn't a tough job. It was really fun. I enjoyed it tremendously. And because my husband and I met here, CMC's always been a very special place for both of us. CMC and its ROTC program prepared me as a leader both in and out of the classroom, and that easily translated to not only my time in the military, but also in the civilian workplace and graduate school. This is a legacy that continues to this day, when the college was created in 1946 for veterans, by veterans, to prepare returning soldiers from war to life in leadership. My husband and I greatly support this, the Alumni Association's Veteran Affairs team. They are co-sponsoring this event tonight. Their mission is to celebrate CMC veterans and its heritage and honor. There are 700 veteran alumni. 6 have given their lives while serving. The Veteran Affairs team also engages students by helping enroll veterans and veterans' children, and also building scholarships and internships at veteran-related organizations like Military Women in Need. They also arrange a few events on campus throughout the academic year, similar to this one. I would like to briefly explain why we celebrate Veterans Day. World War II ended with an armistice between the Allied nations and Germany when it went into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And yes, the following year, President Wilson proclaimed November 11th as the first commemoration of Armistice Day with the following words: "To us in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service, and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us, and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of nations." In the aftermath of World War II and the Korean War, with the urging of veteran organizations, Congress changed Armistice Day to Veterans Day in 1954. Veterans Day, still observed on November 11th, not only preserves the historical significance of the date, but it also focuses our attention on all of America's veterans, both past and present, who honorably served in the armed forces at any time during war or peace. It is a day that is set aside to thank them for their patriotism, willingness to serve, and sacrifice for the common good. Thank you.
So now to introduce our speaker for the night, Linda Hervieux. She is a writer, a journalist, and a photographer whose work has helped to provide us with a fuller picture of the momentous D-Day occasion, and with the help of a vivid account of the tension between racial politics and national service in wartime America. Her work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the New York Daily News, the Daily Beast, and NBCnews.com. She's a native of Lowell, Massachusetts, and currently lives in Paris, France. Her book, Forgotten: The Untold Stories of D-Day's Black Heroes at Home and at War, was published in 2016. She, as you know, is the Veterans Day Athenaeum speaker for 2016. Please join me in welcoming Linda Hervieux.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I appreciate it. And the invitation to CMC and the Athenaeum, I do appreciate. Thank you to Priya Janar and number 1 alum Mustafa, who first heard about my book, for suggesting it. I really am honored to be here. I've been talking about this book for a long time. It was first published last November And the paperback version just came out last week. The British edition comes out next week. So I'm talking about it again, and I'm happy to because I really would like these men to be remembered. Last week I was in Austin, Texas speaking, and the organizers played the video trailer to my book, which I had never seen on a big screen and which I hadn't seen in months. And it made me very emotional to hear these men speak. It's so much more powerful than on a computer or a phone, which is how I was testing it all those months. And I'm going to play it for you. It's only 3 minutes, but it gives you an overview of the book, and it actually allows you to hear the men. So let's see if here we go. Okay, here we go.
My name is Henry Palm, and I belong to the 320th Anti-Aircraft Balloon Barrage Battalion.
My name is William Garfield Dabney. I was with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion.
I did feel like it was our duty to try to protect our country, even though we wasn't recognized as 100% citizen.
When we got into England, people invited us and they wanted to treat us nice because we was American. And that's what they kept calling us, American.
We was all trained to handle these balloons. You would send those balloons up on the cable and that let it up and bring it in. It was something like a canister bomb, and it would pull the bomb right down into the wing of the plane, and boom, the plane would blow up.
We lost the final track. We lost some of the voices there. The final track, Arthur Guest, preacher from South Carolina, says, "I saw many things, and I never will forget." Just such a pleasure to meet these men. Oh, thank you. Thank you. We Americans are told to remember our history, but not all of it. Until September 23rd of this year, there was not one national museum dedicated to African American history. I was very honored to be speaking last night at the Smithsonian's new National Museum for African American History and Culture. It's an astounding museum. If you're in DC, it's worth 2 days. Actually, it's huge. I live in Paris, France, and last month there was this extraordinary series of events dedicated to African Americans and the opening of a great exhibit called The Color Line at the Musée Quai Branly. This was an exhibition, it's basically a retrospective of African American art, but using segregation as a theme, and there are no plans for it to tour here, but it really is something that ought to. is astounding. Remember, it is something we hear all the time. School kids learn about the ride of Paul Revere, but not always Crispus Attucks, the runaway slave who was the first to die in the Boston Massacre. We're told to remember the Civil War, whose battles are still reenacted today. There are tens of thousands of plaques across the South remembering that war and the heroes of the Confederate States of America. Yet until very recently, there were no markers to slavery, to the generations of men, women, and children of color enslaved for 250 years in the British colonies and the independent United States. We're implored to remember the Alamo, but not the war of attrition waged on African Americans after the Civil War, not Jim Crow, that system of legal segregation codifying white supremacy and perpetuating unspeakable racism into our lifetimes, some of our lifetimes. We have monuments and ceremonies to remember the men who died for freedom in the First World War 100 years ago, but none to the nearly 4,000 African Americans lynched between 1877 and 1950. In 1919 alone, 77 black men were killed by lynch mobs. Many of these murders were public events, with children among the gleeful crowd collecting fingers, toes, and ears as souvenirs. In that exhibition in Paris, there are postcards of lynching images. I'd read about these, but I'd never seen one in our country. And on the backs are, Merry Christmas, Bessie, things are doing well here, with an image of an actual lynching on the front. Some of the men killed in 1919 were World War I veterans in uniform. 2 were burned alive. And of course, the greatest generation of the Second World War, they're still very much on our minds. They're on our movie screens and in our history books, but not all of them. Some men, even those who were stars in their day, were forgotten. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about these men. In June 2009, for the 65th anniversary of D-Day, the French government honored an American veteran named William Garfield Dabney. They gave him the Legion of Honor, that country's highest decoration, for his service on June 6, 1944. And this is Omaha Beach in June of 2009. Bill was a member of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African-American combat unit at D-Day. These men were charged with a strange mission: to raise a silver curtain of balloons over Omaha and Utah beaches. The balloons formed a defensive curtain over the coast to protect the men and materiel from dive-bombing German planes. And this is the only known photograph of the 320th on Omaha Beach. The barrage balloons work this way. This is on page 97, I think, of the book, if you want to see it more closely. The balloons were hydrogen-filled gas bags, and they would be suspended up on a cable. It was basically a piano wire. And the cable alone was enough to snag a wing of a plane and crash it, stall it and crash it, or perhaps pull a wing off, even if the force was just right. The balloons that went to war packed a secret punch. They had small bombs that were anchored under the balloons, so with a cable strike, the plane would be ensnared as if in a spider's web. The bomb, which was about a 4-pound bomb, about the size of a soda can, Bill Dabney told me, would detach, and there would be a parachute system that would bring it down, usually on the wing of a plane, or a good hit could explode the gas tank. We reporters wrote about Bill Dabney in 2009 and noted that his battalion was all black. Well, what did that mean? It meant that the enlisted men and some of the non-com officers were black. Perhaps a few of the officers up to first lieutenant. In this unit, I found 1 first lieutenant were black, but the top officers were always white. And this is Colonel Leon J. Reed. He was the commander of the 320th, and unlike many of the Southern commanders, he's a graduate of the Citadel, Unlike many Southern commanders that dominated the Army ranks in World War II, he was very popular with his men. They thought he was a great guy, and there's a lot of tributes to him among the men. Bill Dabney received his medal at a ceremony at Invalides in Paris, and this is Bill wearing his French Légion d'honneur in the backyard of his home in Roanoke, Virginia. Invalides, as many of you might know, is that temple to all things military in France. Napoleon is buried under the Gold Dome. After the ceremony, Bill shook the hands of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. He had no idea who they were until his son said, do you know who those guys are? But he knew very well that there were no men of color storming Omaha Beach in their movie, Saving Private Ryan. All black veterans know this. It is a sore point. In fact, no movies about D-Day show black soldiers. Few books about D-Day mention the 320th or that there were nearly 2,000 African American troops on the Normandy beaches by the end of that extraordinary day. This is a shot of Omaha Beach on June 7th, 1944. You can see the barrage balloons over the ships. All of the balloons that were flown on land were flown by soldiers of color. The 320th was among 2 black units given a commendation by General Eisenhower for their service, yet we don't know about them. And why does that matter? Well, there were many who considered D-Day to be the most important day of the 20th century. For the Allied commanders knew if they could get their troops onto those beaches, up and over those bluffs, it was only a matter of time till their troops would be marching through Berlin. And I would argue that to exclude a significant portion of our population from that momentous day does our country a tremendous disservice. The great General Omar Bradley said that all of the men who landed on Omaha Beach were heroes, yet there were heroes among the heroes. As I began my research into this book, I learned that one of the men of the 320th, a college student, would become a star in Black America and beyond for his service on Omaha Beach. He would be nominated for the Medal of Honor. He would not get it. None of the 1 million African Americans who served in World War II received America's highest honor until 1997, when President Bill Clinton awarded 7 of them. Those awards came after an independent study commissioned by the Army found that pervasive racism within the ranks denied black soldiers the decorations they deserved and the opportunities they deserved. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that 320th soldier. His name was Waverly Bernard Woodson, Jr. And we'll start early morning, June 6, 1944, somewhere in the English Channel. This is from chapter 9. Waverly Woodson squinted into the distance. From the deck of the boat, he could see little. A thick cloud blanket hung overhead, and the heavy air pressed in from all sides. For hours now, he had peered into the blackness. A stripe of pink brightened the eastern horizon. First light. In the dark, choppy waters of the English Channel, Woodson found serenity, even beauty. It would be one of his last tranquil moments on this very long day. It was a strange place to find peace. Above, the sky hummed with Allied planes, and all around, thousands of vessels of every size steamed toward France. On Woodson's ship, men were gray with seasickness. Their single Army-issue vomit bag was long used up, so they heaved into their steel helmets, then tipped them over the side to be rinsed in the cresting swells. When that effort proved too much, they heaved wherever they could. Puddles of sick pooled at their ankles. The metal boat pitched forward and back with each roll. Dying would be better than this. Some of them said that. The storied channel had thwarted generations of marauders to keep Britannia safe, at least most of the time. The Roman Emperor Caligula's soldiers mutinied rather than sail these waters thick with mermaids. On this day, the invaders were heading in the opposite direction, their mission to conquer a continent systematically crushed by an enemy for whom freedom meant very little. To Woodson, freedom meant a great deal. He lived it fully for the first time in a friendly village in England, where he'd met white people pleased to be his friend and a postmistress happy to dance with him. That might not have seemed like much to other men, but Woodson would never forget it. Deafening booms shook the men to their soaking boots as the great battleships opened fire, each blast of their guns lighting the murky dawn with flame and smoke. The noise was almost impossible to believe. To Ernest Hemingway, who was aboard a small boat in the channel that day, it sounded as though they were throwing whole railway cars across the sky. The powerful concussion reverberated through the fleet and struck your ear like a punch with a dry, heavy glove. An Associated Press reporter in one of those boats initially mistook the men's violent trembling for fear. Yet these men were ready. This was the day for which they had trained for years. For the British, with bitter memories of being driven back into the sea at Dunkirk in 1940, the wait had been far longer. The bombardment was an awesome display of might. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, had promised his troops the greatest show on earth. The GIs and Tommies watching from the water were certain that no enemy could survive it. For Woodson, this journey to France was a most unexpected chapter in his young life. Odds were low that a black man would be in this landing, yet Woodson was used to defying expectations. Unlike many of his friends in West Philadelphia, Woodson hadn't waited for a draft notice. He'd left his pre-med studies at Lincoln University, where he was in his 2nd year, and enlisted in the Army on December 15, 1942. His younger brother, Eugene Lloyd, had signed up too and was stationed in Texas with a unit of the Tuskegee Airmen. It was a source of tremendous pride for their parents, and the doings of the Woodson brothers would become regular items in the newspapers back home. There were 2 armies in World War II, black and white. There were 2 of everything: barracks, mess halls, service clubs, buses, and train cars. It was a highly inefficient and extremely expensive way to run an army. Yet there was one sector that was integrated officer candidate school. The Army didn't think that black men were smart enough to score high enough on the entrance exam, an exam heavily weighted to favor whites and their school learning, so they didn't bother to set up a separate system. But Waverly Woodson scored high on the test and trained as an anti-aircraft artillery officer. In the end, there were no officer positions available to him. It was a common story for black officers whose service was limited by quotas and the rule that they not lead white officers junior to them. So Woodson was assigned to train as a medic with the 320th. On the morning of June 6th, he was headed to Omaha Beach with 4 other medics. In spite of the turbulent seas, the order to go had been a relief. Woodson and the 4 medics had endured several uncomfortable days aboard this metal bucket, a landing craft tank, jockeying for space with 5 dozen men. Behind the boat carrying the medics, the rest of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was scattered among more than 150 landing craft. Thousands of barrage balloons had been inflated in England by Royal Air Force crews and then tethered to ships and smaller craft for the journey to France. Floating above the ships, the balloons formed a miles-wide aerial curtain, their shining silvery shapes carved in relief against the flat, pewter sky. Their job was to protect the fleet from German dive bombers, which would be loath to tangle with the lethal balloon cables. Once ashore, the men of the 320th would rush the balloons onto the beach, transferring the protective veil to land. This assumed that the small arms fire was cleared from the beach, but as any armchair scholar of D-Day knows, things didn't go quite as expected on D-Day. Most of the 621 men in the 320th Assault Force were headed to a 5-mile-long crescent-shaped patch of sand once known as Beach 313. The Americans renamed it Omaha, and it was one of the 5 beaches the Allies had to seize on June 6 in the 17 hours of daylight available to them. War planners expected a bloodbath on Omaha, the most challenging terrain, where enemy guns lay hidden in scrub-covered bluffs as high as 170 feet. Omaha is where the medics were headed. They would be the first African Americans ashore if they made it to the beach alive. Woodson made it to the beach alive, just barely. As the boat carrying Woodson and the medics approached Omaha Beach, all eyes were on the water. Around them, men bobbed in a sea made red by their own blood. Those still alive waited to be pulled from the drink by boats that might never come. The skippers of the landing craft had been ordered to ignore their cries for help, and men in motor launches with megaphones dissuaded those with second thoughts. "You are not a rescue ship," hollered one of them. "Get on shore." First, Woodson's craft hit a mine, which blew out the motor. Then another blast exploded on the right side, felling troops like matchsticks. The heavy fire kept coming. The LCT's 40-millimeter guns, which had been blazing moments earlier, now lay silent. The bodies of their gunners hung lifeless as if from a gruesome clothesline. A shell landed on the hood of a Jeep, incinerating the 4 men inside. Woodson crouched beside a truck filled with medical supplies. Shells missed the ship, exploded in the water, and sent a shower of burning metal shards raining on deck. A soldier beside Woodson was hit and killed. Woodson's lower extremities burned. He reached down and brought up a hand covered in blood. "I am dying," he thought. One of the medics slapped dressings on his buttocks and inner thigh, ripped open by shrapnel. "Close," Woodson would say later. "Mighty close." The medics tended to the few men still living. The helpless craft drifted to a stop, and the ramp fell with a bang. To Woodson's surprise, the tank came alive. It rolled down the ramp onto the beach and turned right. The men followed it, splashing down in 4 feet of water. Woodson and medics Eugene Worthy and Alfred Bell, both from Memphis, hit the beach and ran, slugs popping mini geysers of sand at their feet. Woodson looked back and saw the tank's turret in flames. No men were coming out. It was 9 a.m. In the shelter of the shingle, Woodson unpacked a tent roll he had pulled out of the water. Now there was a medical station. The rising tide carried in the dead and threatened to drown the living. Under constant fire, the medics dragged the wounded and dead out of the shooting gallery at the water's edge. Their Red Cross brassards made them easy targets for German snipers hiding in the bluffs, who ignored the rules of war and fired on many medics that day. There were too many men who needed saving. Their cries for help would haunt Woodson. On Omaha, war was a great equalizer. At that time, Woodson would say later, they didn't care what color my skin was. Throughout the day and night and into the next day, Woodson worked through his pain to save lives. He pulled out bullets, patched gaping wounds, and dispensed blood plasma. He amputated a right foot. When he thought he could do no more, he resuscitated 4 drowning men. 30 hours after he set his boots on Omaha Beach, Woody Woodson collapsed. There is a sole piece of paper at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, that proves Waverly Woodson was nominated for the Medal of Honor. It is a handwritten note from an aide in the War Department to an aide in the White House that says, quote, "A Negro from Philadelphia was recommended for a suitable award," underlined, and that U.S. General John Lee in Britain upgraded that recommendation to the Medal of Honor. There is no trace today of the records that explain Waverly Woodson's medals. It is a common story. Only 1% of Army records from World War II exist today. And a fire in the Army's archives in St. Louis, Missouri in 1973 destroyed 80% of personnel records. What we know is that Woodson got a Purple Heart for his injuries and belatedly a Bronze Star for his service on Omaha Beach. That's 4th place. To the Army, the note in the Truman Library is hearsay, but there is further proof of Woodson's actions in Normandy. In the summer of 1944, Waverly Woodson was a huge star. The crusading black press hailed him as #1 invasion hero. White newspapermen came to interview him. Stars and Stripes wrote that Woodson and the medics covered themselves with glory on D-Day. Woodson returned home a celebrity, and the accolades continued. He was invited to recount his heroics on a national radio show, and the black press began calling on the White House to award him the Medal of Honor. Significantly, stapled to the note in the Truman Library is an Army press release dated October 28, 1944, detailing Woodson's heroism, that the Army would praise the individual actions of any soldier, but particularly a black soldier on Omaha Beach, was nothing short of extraordinary. There is a white soldier who did receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 6, actions remarkably similar to Woodson's, except he was not injured. I detail what he did in chapter 9 of the book. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the French government chose a trio of Americans to honor. They flew them to France and presented them with a palm-sized medal commemorating their service in Normandy. I was the only black man of the three, Woodson said proudly. He was 72 years old, and this is a photo of Waverly and his wife Joanne Woodson around that time. Woodson died on August 12, 2005. His grave is in Arlington National Cemetery, where America buries its heroes. Every Memorial Day, Joanne visits his white marble grave with an armful of her husband's favorite red roses that he grew to championship levels in his retirement, won many prizes for them. In June of 2015, President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor to a black soldier from World War I named Henry Johnson. This is Henry Johnson wearing his French Croix de Guerre medal. Sergeant Johnson was a member of the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry from New York. He single-handedly fought off a German raiding party that attacked the trench he was guarding, using up all of his weapons until all he had left was his bolo knife. His story is detailed in chapter 2 of the book. Like Woodson, Johnson was a star. He made headlines from coast to coast. What most of those readers did not know was that Henry Johnson and his regiment were given over to French command by the American general John J. Pershing, who didn't want Negroes in his army. The Hellfighters fought in French uniforms alongside French poilus and received French medals for their extraordinary record. They served more days on the front line than any other American unit. The French called them the Men of Bronze. The Germans called them Hellfighters for the ferocity and battle. And the mythic fear of the black soldier among German soldiers would continue into World War II, which contrasts to something I'll read soon about the view of the black soldier in the American Army. Johnson died 11 years after the war in poverty without even a Purple Heart for his injuries and therefore no medical benefits to treat his wartime injuries. In a ceremony at the White House, the president said, "It is never too late to say thank you." There is a campaign underway to persuade the powers that be in Washington to award the Medal of Honor to Waverly Woodson, led by his family in the office of Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen, who just was elected to the Senate in Maryland. The homepage on my website, which is myname.com, links to the petition. If you agree, perhaps, with the case made for Woodson, you might consider adding your name. It just takes a click. In 1941, when the men of the 320th began receiving their draft notices, the Army was a bastion of racism. The ranks were dominated by Southern commanders who determined that Southern officers like them were best suited to handle black men. This is a photo of the 320th in France in the summer of 1944. How bad was it? Well, to understand the world these men were thrust into, it's necessary to understand that Army policy at that time was a lesson in what happens when racism meets pseudoscience. The science at the time held that black brains were smaller than white brains, and sometimes hat size was used to measure this difference. An Army War College study from 1925, still on the books in World War II, was indicative of the type of thinking that underpinned Army policy toward the black soldier in World War II. And I'll read you a bit from it because it seems so over the top that it couldn't possibly be a belief. But when you take away the rights of men, and in this case, assigning them, taking away many of the combat duties they had been assigned in earlier wars, you have to dehumanize them, don't you? And so perhaps that's why we see examples of this, not just this study, but similar things in the Army records of that time. The Negro is profoundly superstitious. He is by nature subservient and naturally believes himself inferior to the white. He is jolly, tractable, lively, and docile by nature, but through real or supposed harsh or unjust treatment may become sullen and stubborn. He has not the physical courage of the white. He simply cannot control himself in fear of some danger to the degree that the white man can. His psychology is such that he willingly accepts hard labor and for this reason can well be employed in labor troops or other non-combatant branches. The Negro is unmoral. He simply does not see certain things as wrong. The Negro is one of the most secretive in the world. While the Negro undoubtedly has a state of mind bordering on resentment against the white, this feeling is numbed by his easygoing nature. The Negro's growing sense of importance will make them more and more of a problem, and racial problems may well be expected to increase. Well, that part was certainly true. Anger in Black America toward treatment of their men in uniform was rising and would be blamed in part for sparking more than 200 race riots that would rock America in 1943. One of the men who got one of those draft notices in June 1941 was a 21-year-old in Atlantic City named Wilson Caldwell Monk. For Monk, being drafted meant a steady paycheck. The $30 he would earn monthly in the Army was a measure of security he very much needed. In Atlantic City, the country's first planned resort town, there were 3 months to earn your money by stringing together as many jobs as you could before Labor Day, when the curtain fell and Atlantic City shut up tight. The odds of getting a decent job during the long, cold winter were slight. At that time, America was not at war, so Wilson Monk expected a 1-year commitment. He was in for a surprise, and an even bigger surprise when he boarded a train and headed south to his first Army training camp. Somewhere north of Washington, D.C., he was told he had to switch to the Negro car. He had no idea what that meant. The Negro car was always hard by the noisy, dirty coal engine, so a soldier in uniform would arrive wherever he was going covered in black soot. The train south was the first taste of Jim Crow for the North's black recruits, who would arrive at their first day of boot camp already fuming. Jim Crow, as most of you know, was a series of laws in the southern United States that ensured the separation of the races. What you might not know is that they included such crimes as pretending to be a white man. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws spread through the South like a poisonous weed, so that by 1890, the races were effectively separate, and black men and women had to step off sidewalks and avert their eyes when passing whites. At an Army base in Pennsylvania, the black troops were warned that any contact with a white woman, whether voluntary or not, would be considered rape and the penalty, death. Wilson Monk was stationed at Camp Tyson, Tennessee, an Army base in northwestern Tennessee built for the purpose of teaching men to fly barrage balloons. The first balloons were intended to protect defense plants and military installations. They were huge, 900 pounds, about the length of 2 school buses. The balloons that went to war with the Americans were smaller, first in Italy and then in France. They were about 125 pounds. Bill Dabney says about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. Of the 30 or so units that trained at Tyson, 4 were black. Chapter 5 of my book describes their experiences in the South. I call this chapter, "We Were Like Little Dogs," because that is how Sergeant Samuel L. Madison from Columbus, Ohio, described his time there to me. This is Sam in 2010. And this is Wilson Monk with a barrage balloon, probably at Camp Tyson. One day in the spring of 1943, Wilson Monk and some friends boarded a train and headed to Memphis on a weekend pass. They were excited to check out Beale Street and the astounding things happening there with black music. Their first stop was a diner, where Monk asked for change to play the jukebox. The man behind the counter threw back a handful of nickels and told Monk, "If you weren't in uniform, you wouldn't get nothing from me." What Monk didn't know was that he got off easy because wearing the uniform of the United States Army in the South often posed problems for black soldiers. Southern whites saw a proud display of patriotism by a black man as a provocation. And it only got worse. Monk and his friends went looking for a place to grab a bite. Outside one restaurant, they watched, incredulous, as a long line of German prisoners of war filed inside. Black men were not welcome there. Most Americans don't know today, I certainly didn't, that there were 425,000 German and Italian POWs interned in the United States during World War II, most of them at army bases in the South, where they enjoyed privileges not accorded to black soldiers. The fact that these enemy prisoners enjoyed often backslapping treatment by their white guards was extremely painful for men like Wilson Monk, who even 7 decades after the war spoke about it with fresh hurt. But it was hearing this story from Wilson Monk that I got a lesson in the northern version of Jim Crow. The stories I learned about Atlantic City were so fascinating that I led the book there on the boardwalk. If there are any fans of HBO's Boardwalk Empire here, the author who wrote the book that inspired that series wrote a sequel called The North Side about Black Atlantic City, and it is absolutely fascinating. This is Wilson and his sweetheart, Martina Madison. They posed for this portrait in 1941 at Lauriston Studios on the boardwalk before he left for basic training. They had a coupon, so they got 2. One of these is still with us today, so we have this lovely picture of them. Wilson Monk told me that the restaurant in Memphis was called Childs. And he knew that chain because there was one in Atlantic City. And I don't know why I said it, but I said to him, "But you could eat in that one." And he said, "Oh, no, we couldn't." He assumed I knew this. And that was when I realized how bad life was in the North for African Americans. It was a lesson I hadn't learned in any of the schools I had attended. I had a very typical Northern Massachusetts education. And I wondered why we Americans must take specialized classes to learn our own history. And it's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I'd like to close by telling you about Wilson Monk and the 320th Battalion's journey to freedom. They found it in a most unexpected place in Great Britain. After leaving Tennessee, the men of the 320th boarded train cars headed for New York. They had to draw the curtains because Dixie Whites were known to fire at train cars carrying black soldiers. In New York, they trudged aboard a Cunard ocean liner converted into a troop carrier. This is the ocean liner Aquitania in Lower Manhattan with the Woolworth building in the background. It's a postcard from her glory days as one of the floating palaces that the Brits had on the seas. For the war, she was painted a gunmetal blue. Those 4 stacks, only 3 were needed. The 4th was just for panache. They were painted a really dull gray. If there's any fans of World War I, she's the sister ship of the Lusitania, which was sunk and was said to be one of the reasons America entered the war. Not quite true, but these ships were storied. They were chronicled in the newspapers of the time. The people aboard them were listed. The passenger lists were listed. Photographers waited for them to dock in New York and took pictures of the people who got off them or who boarded them. So some of the men knew this, and being on one of these ships was a big deal. The Aquitania was one of the 3 fastest passenger ships in the world. The other 2 were the Queens, the Mary and the Elizabeth. They traveled alone without convoys to slow them down. The ship sailed out of New York Harbor past the Statue of Liberty and headed into the hunting grounds of the North Atlantic, where German subs were gunning for ships packed with as many as 16,000 young Americans and Canadians, exactly like their ship. The sinking of any one of these ships would have been the greatest tragedy to befall the Allies. They all made it, though many smaller ships were sunk. The ship zigzagged across the ocean in a harrowing journey that I describe in chapter 6. It's as close as the book comes to being a thriller. The men arrived, we know they survived, and the men arrived in Scotland in 1943, and for the next 7 months in the villages of Oxfordshire, England, and Wales, they would enjoy liberties they had never thought possible. where white people were happy to meet them, share their meager war rations, and forge lasting friendships. This is a sketch of the 320th by a local artist in Checkenden, Oxfordshire. It shows the 320th men performing in the village hall New Year's Eve 1943. It is the only image that exists, to my knowledge, of the 320th in Britain. Photographic chemicals were rationed, so while these men have pictures of themselves in France, there's none in Britain. So I was thrilled to find this in the record office there. In Britain, Black servicemen and women were Americans first. You can hear George Hamilton say that in the trailer. We did get that. George Hamilton just passed away a few months ago. The importance of these experiences abroad for hundreds of thousands of Black GIs cannot be overemphasized. It was epic. It was through their time abroad in Europe, even in occupied Germany, that African Americans like Wilson Monk, Samuel Madison, and Bill Dabney learned that race hatred was not a natural state of affairs. These experiences abroad would help shape the budding American civil rights movement that would really rock the country in the coming decades. Wilson Monk was billeted in the hall of a stately stone church called Trinity Methodist in the village of Abersucken in southern Wales. One day he asked the church organist if he and his friends might attend Sunday services. "Well, of course you can," said the organist, Geoffrey Pryor, who was also the village milkman. Pryor had no idea that in America none of these men would have stepped foot in a white church. Then Geoffrey Pryor did Wilson Monk one better. He introduced him to this woman, his wife, Jessie. The Pryor's 18-year-old son was off fighting with the British forces, and Wilson Monk became their surrogate son. Like most Britons, the Pryors had never met a person of color until the Americans came, and they in turn were the first white people who Wilson had ever considered his friends. And so an extraordinary correspondence began between Jessie Pryor and Wilson Monk's mother, Rosita, in Atlantic City. And I'll end by reading you from one of those letters. Chapter 7, A Taste of Freedom, Abersucken, South Wales, February 1944. My dear Mrs. Monk, how are you? I expect you will be very surprised receiving this letter from me. I feel I must write you and tell you how very delighted we are meeting Wilson and having him in our home. Wilson Monk, you have a son to treasure and feel very proud of. We love him very dearly and will do anything in the world for him. All we regret is we cannot have him home more, but duties won't allow. He does come as often as possible. We have told him he can look upon our home as his home while he is in our country, and I will try to fill your place, if only in a small way. But don't worry much about him while he was here. We will take every care of him. If he is ever ill or in any way wanting, we shall be there. We look upon him now as our own. Mother to mother, very sincerely with loving thoughts, Jessie Pryor, XXXXX. This is Wilson and Martina in 2010. They were married for 60 years. If you'd like to know more about them, Waverly Woodson, Bill Dabney, or the other men, my website is a complement to the book, and there's a page for every man I could find. And because of that group picture that you saw earlier, a couple families have reached out to me and said that their fathers and uncles are in the picture, so I'll be adding more pages when I finish traveling for the book. You can click the 320th gallery and read about all of them. You can see more pictures. There's more on the balloons. There's more on the ship. And if you like the book, please consider writing a review on Amazon. Unfortunately, these things are very important. So thank you. We'll take your questions if you have any.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and Michael or I will come to you with the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I'm a little nervous asking this question because I don't want it to seem as though I don't want you to be doing the work that you are. And keep in mind, I wouldn't know how to ask this question or answer this question if someone asked me.
There's no wrong questions.
Good. What is it like being a white woman writing this book? And what has the response been to that?
I get asked this question by white people every time I talk. It's never been asked by a black audience. No, I have received nothing but warmth and friendship and help from these men. There's a couple of things to point out about that, though, and that is, I think those of us who know veterans know that veterans are reluctant to tell their war stories. As young reporters, you're sent out every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, and you're told, go get a story. And you want these men to share their war stories. You want a good top, a lead of your story. And you go from one to the other, and they just won't talk about it. My dad was in the Pacific in World War II. He never talked about it. But did I ever ask? No. And the same thing with the children of these men. Some of the children of these men did not know their fathers were at D-Day until I was interviewing them, which I think is extraordinary. And part of that's veteran reticence that comes naturally with veterans. But the other part of it is, as one man told me, who cares about the deeds of black men? Another part of it is these men really protected their kids from Jim Crow, from knowing how it was. This is before the Black Power movement. This is before any sort of movement to know where we came from, to celebrate our history or just acknowledge it. And these men did not want their kids to know how bad life was for them. They protected them from it. Very different than a couple generations later, where the history of the black community was emphasized among the black community. And so I came at a good time. These men were in their 90s. Bill Dabney from Roanoke was the baby of the battalion, and in 2009 he was 89. So time was running out, and they were ready to talk. Wilson Monk said to me, I've been waiting for someone to call me for 50 years, which isn't quite true. His son did ask him, and he didn't want to talk about it. So I think it was a combination of them being ready. But in terms of the racial aspect of it, I didn't feel that they were holding back because I was white, but I felt that some of them were holding back greatly because I was a woman, and they didn't want to tell me some of these stories. Their sons did after. They'd say, oh yeah, after you came, ask my dad about the dances in England, ask him about this. They didn't want to talk about the private stuff, the happy stuff. The girls went crazy for them in Britain. Crazy, absolutely crazy. The number one boyfriend to have if you were an English girl in World War II was an American GI, because they were paid 3 times as much as the British. They had tons of stuff. They had nylon stockings they gave out. I mean, why the Army stocked so many of those? It's an enduring mystery of World War II. They had tin fruit. It was like a cornucopia to be around the Americans. And the girls, and not just the girls, the British in general, found the Americans, the African Americans, to have much better manners. The white Americans, in a lot of places, wore out their welcome, and I talk about that in Chapter 7. It's something that we don't really talk about today. The quote at the top of the chapter is by George Orwell, who wrote in a London magazine that he wrote for that the only Americans with any manners were the Negroes. And he got a lot of outraged letters because the British didn't want to speak ill of the Americans. They were so grateful that the Americans came. And I think we forget today, I certainly forgot, that the belief was, early in the war, that there was going to be a land invasion by Germany and the Brits were going to fall very quickly. And in the Roosevelt White House, there was dissension as to whether or not the Americans should step in. And that really didn't change till really Pearl Harbor. So, and by the way, Pearl Harbor, if these balloons had been flying as they should have been, that was exactly the type of attack they were designed to prevent. So that's in Chapter 4, the whole history of balloons from Napoleon up. So, does anybody else? So I went a little afield on that, but these are things I didn't put in the talk, but I get asked, so I figured it was a good segue. So, does anyone else have a question? No?
And if that's okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned just a little bit during your talk about the perceptions of black soldiers that the Nazis had, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on that just a little bit more about the way that these individuals, if they were captured as POWs or in any other interactions they had with the Germans, if you could talk about the way they were treated.
Well, the interactions in occupied Germany, because after the Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the last really big pushes, the Americans lost so many troops that the Army put out a call for volunteers among the African American service troops, because most African Americans were in service battalions, building roads, digging ditches, that kind of thing. And so many African Americans volunteered to be combat soldiers that they were among some of the first soldiers to push into Germany. And they were treated so well by German people who had been infused with Nazi doctrine for a long time, like well over a decade. And it's astounding that they were treated well, to me, frankly, much better than their own country. And the other part of the German question that's interesting is the Tuskegee Airmen, the famed squadrons of black pilots, fought missions, accompanied bombers and on missions in North Africa and in some parts of Europe. And German planes would see them, the pilots would do a double take, because there had been this mythic fear of the black soldiers since World War I. And it was really because of the Harlem Hellfighters. They weren't the only black troops in the trenches, but the black soldier, for whatever reason, got a reputation for being just the ultimate fighters. And Henry Johnson's story certainly was indicative of that. I'm sure that the story of Henry Johnson, and you can Google him, because when he got the Medal of Honor posthumously, finally, it was a 20-year campaign, by the way, to get him the Medal of Honor. When he finally got the Medal of Honor, the White House and the Army did a tribute to him, and so you can easily read about him online. And what's interesting about Henry Johnson is when the morning after, so he fights off a German raiding party with all his weapons until all he has left was his bolo knife, and the troops that came to that trench in the morning saw the drag marks and the remains of what they assumed was a horrific battle, not knowing that it was just Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts together in that trench. And Roberts was knocked unconscious. He was being dragged as a prisoner by the fleeing Germans, and Henry Johnson saved him. And so these stories were told and retold and retold, and that probably accounts for the mythology among the Germans, because they certainly didn't have too much contact with black soldiers. There were a couple of combat divisions, but I mean, there wasn't, compared to the white troops, there weren't that many. And these black soldiers, I talk about this in chapter 2, they were really sent into battle with inferior weapons, inferior training. In these southern training camps, southern whites did not want black soldiers to have ammunition in their guns. They were terrified of these armed men of color. And so a lot of these men were sent to war without ever having trained with live ammunition. So there's stories like that are legion. So there's many sides to it. So part of the German fear is a mythology developed from lack of contact, in fact. So that's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Any other questions anybody has? Yes.
Hey, thank you very much for coming tonight. It was very informative. The fact that these guys got French awards, has that moved the needle at all over here to get them recognition? I mean, is there a kind of embarrassment that maybe these guys were not recognized at home?
No, not at all. And that's interesting, because what we know about African American soldiers, we really know because the French have honored them. And not just African Americans, the French have honored many Americans. The French like to have ceremonies honoring Americans. And for every major anniversary, of D-Day, they've invited Americans over, and they've included men of color because they made such an impression in Normandy. And so the men in my battalion did not have as much contact with civilians as some of the other black troops. Black troops drove the trucks. They were 75% of the drivers of the Red Ball Express, which is the famed supply chain from the beaches to the front lines. There are some tank units. There's one black tank unit that landed with Patton in Normandy. These men became famous in Normandy among the population. And I don't get into that in this book because these men, their job was to stay on the beaches. So when they landed with the infantry, they were essentially infantry troops. That small arms fire on the beaches hadn't been cleared, so these men couldn't get their balloons up. So they were digging trenches, they were rounding up German prisoners. They were doing what infantry troops did, though the infantry's job was to get off the beach and their job was to stay on. So you don't really hear a lot about what happened on June 7th, after D-Day. And so I had to go looking for that, and it was very interesting. I thought it mustn't be interesting because you never hear about it, but it actually was. So thank you for that question. No, zero. President Obama in Normandy said to Bill Dabney, "I read about you in the New York Times, Dabney." And Michelle gave him a kiss. But was there even the mayor of Roanoke didn't know that they had a recipient of the French Legion of Honor in Roanoke. He was invited to my talk at the African American Museum there and had no idea who Bill was, which is astounding because Henry Parham, who from Pittsburgh, originally from Greensville County, Virginia, he leads Chapter 3. Henry Parham was the D-Day go-to guy for the Pittsburgh media. He was very easy to find because he was always interviewed through the years whenever they needed a vet. He was the guy. But it didn't get him anything until we found him, and then the French awarded him the Legion of Honor medal 2 years ago at the embassy in Washington. So we got him a little bit of recognition, but again, from the French. The Army's very rigid. I mean, the Army doesn't want to set precedents, which is the uphill battle facing the Medal of Honor campaign. There's a lot of, you need a records trail of medals. You need a living witness to attest to what was done. So even though we have all these newspaper articles, we have an Army press release, we have the note from the War Department to the White House, it's not enough. So hopefully Senate-elect Van Hollen will keep on this, so his office, we hope. So, yes.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to thank you very much for writing the book. I'm really impressed with that. And I also wanted to say, when you first put the pictures up there, I found myself just staring at those photos, wondering if I would really see someone that I knew. I mean, I really looked at that, because I'm not so far removed from that. And the stories of my grandparents and my great-grandparents resonate with what you just said. And I think also the stories that go past them to where I am today, all the way into the Vietnam War, where a lot of what you're describing here was actually still going on. So I'm very keenly aware of that. My question for you, I think, though, has to do more with what was it? What was the sort of the key point that sparked your interest in looking into this deeper? Because I appreciate that you've done that.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I should probably slip that in because I don't really talk about that. And people are curious. Well, when I wrote the story about Bill Dabney getting the Legion of Honor in June 2009, I felt it was a shame to just write one newspaper story about these men. I had learned a lot about, I didn't even know the Army was segregated. Fort Devens, Massachusetts, near where I grew up, was Jim Crow, right in the heart of Massachusetts. I mean, I had no idea. And so most of these men, however, were in the South. This is where the best weather was for training. And so I had a lot of questions, and I also thought they were very interesting. They told us that he was the last living member of this battalion. And then like a few days later, I called up and said, well, how do you know that? And the organizers said, well, we just assume. I mean, they're in their 90s. It's like, oh, good. Good reporting. None of us asked, how do you know that? And everybody wrote it. Everybody wrote it. So I talked to a friend of mine at a magazine in New York, and I said, do you think a magazine would want something on these men? Because it's a shame to just do, one story. And I sent him the story, and he said, that's a book, and you should really talk to an agent. And I did, and she said, I can sell that. And I said, well, how do you know? I don't even know what I have. And she said, no, a forgotten World War II unit. There aren't books written about individual units anymore. And balloons, like, what are the balloons? So she said I could sell that. And so just on that, I spent 2 years researching a book proposal, sort of on my own steam, not knowing if I would sell it. And the way it works is when you have a book proposal, it goes up, nonfiction books, not novels, but nonfiction books, it goes up for auction, and publishing houses bid on it, and that money that you get is probably all the money you're gonna make. And if you have a heavy research book like I did, I had to hire 4 researchers along the way, lots of travel. You need to have a substantial advance so you can cover your costs and hopefully make some money, but a lot of authors never make a penny. And so that was my hope, and I was able to do the book, so I was very grateful for that book sold. But if it hadn't sold, would I have been able to finish it? I hope so. At this point, I really felt like I was going to let down these guys, and also I felt I was racing. I wanted them to see the book. And, Wilson Monk died, 9 months before the book came out. 4 days before I called him to say that I'd found the prior grandchildren, and we had that link again. So I felt I was racing against the clock, So it started out as just interest in something forgotten about, and then it became sort of loyalty to these men and not wanting to let them down, I think, more than anything. So, anybody else? Yes, Mustafa. Oh.
Mustafa Mirza, I'm class of 76. The question is not exactly relevant to what you're in line with the book, but you may know a lot more. So, African Americans were allowed in service corps and in nursing corps. Were there women at D-Day or in World War II in Europe?
Were
African American
women. There's
nurses or others. Now we have a lieutenant colonel sitting here,
Yeah.
Gloria, but that's a much later period, the Vietnam period. So.
Thank you for your service. No, the short answer is no. African American women, I'm sure that there were some women medics. They weren't in Normandy. There is a story of a postal battalion of women, all women, African American women in Britain, that is legendary. And I talk a little bit about it in the book, but the good bits are in the footnotes and the endnotes at the end. A lot of things I couldn't fit into the chapter are there. And this postal battalion, it was so interesting because these women were from the rural South, and a lot of them were laundresses, and they knew how to make a uniform look really nice. And so they got off their ship. They were marching through, I think it was Manchester, I'm not sure now, or Birmingham, I think. And the British were out cheering them and clapping, and the women who looked really regal and in their crisp uniforms were tearing up, and it was so emotional for them. And as one of them says, it was the first time that white people thought we were beautiful. And there's a little second part of the story, which is interesting. They were such a novelty, being this all-women unit, doing all of the mail for the troops, that in Britain, that every big top commander who came through wanted to visit and see just wanted to, ogle these women. And the woman commander of the battalion got so sick of this that she cut the 2 front legs of the chair that the general or whoever would sit in. shorter so that it would be so uncomfortable that he would sit down and just get out as soon as possible. So that's a funny story. And I use it, though, to tell the unfunny story about how in some towns, the Army commanders were not supposed to segregate. Eisenhower knew very well that the Brits would never accept Jim Crow, but still some Army commanders persuaded local towns to keep things separate, and where these women were, the public pool was not open to them, and they were very offended by that. So there's a story, there's a whole book there about African American women and their contributions that I hope somebody does. But no, not at Normandy. They weren't there. I don't remember ever hearing about white American women being there either. So not on D-Day. So anyone else? Yes.
I'm interested in the two kinds of segregation that you talked about. One is segregation of blacks in their own units from whites in their own units. The other is segregation of blacks from combat roles. You mentioned several things, the Tuskegee Airmen and a couple of tank battalions, and so the extent to which they were permitted to participate in combat roles. I'm wondering how you would compare, let's say, any 20th century war, World War II in particular, with, let's say, the Civil War, where blacks had a major combat role in the latter part of the war, and Vietnam and today?
Well, that's a very good question, because in the Civil War, if anyone's seen the movie Glory, the Massachusetts 54th, not just the Civil War, but also the Indian Wars, black soldiers really distinguished themselves. Medal of Honors were given right up until World War I. World War I is where we have this drought. You know, no medals were given World War I. World War II, deliberately, that Army study found. And so what we saw was a record of heroism. The Buffalo Soldiers, the nickname of, you're testing me now. I want to say the 92nd, but I'm so worried I'm making a mistake there. It's been a while since I've talked about them. I'm going to look it up after. No, I'm pretty sure it's 92nd Division. So the Buffalo Soldiers got their name from Native Americans because they were so brave in patrolling the American West. Why were they patrolling the American West? Because Southern whites didn't want these vast units of black men in their towns. So they were shipped to the American frontier, and they were sent to basically conquer the Native American tribes. And the Native Americans respected them, and they got the name the Buffalo Soldiers with a buffalo patch on their sleeves for bravery. So that Army study in 1925 that I read you, that was part of the dehumanizing of the black soldier. He's not courageous. He's childlike. I mean, these were old canards and stereotypes that went all the way back to slavery. The idea of not being courageous, the idea of slaves coming from Africa being the less intelligent, less courageous ones who couldn't survive in Africa and were given over by their countrymen. These were the stories that were spread in the South to justify slavery, to justify dehumanizing human beings. And so we see it up in the wars. And so from the Civil War forward, we see, I mean, the Civil War, these units were segregated also. So you're saying the units had black soldiers and white soldiers. They didn't. I mean, they had all the enlisted men in these units, and most of the non-coms, probably all the non-coms actually, were black. It was the top officers who were white, just the very top. And a lot of these commanders were demoted from white units. They had messed up, and they were very resentful to be put in charge of black soldiers. So what do you think happened? You know, when you talk about the bad training and the abuse that's detailed in Chapter 5 and that in many other books about the black soldier, what you see is these commanders who were so resentful of being put in charge of them that, you know, General Allman very famously told the 92nd Division in Italy, I didn't ask for you, and you're going to take your share of casualties. And they did, you know. So imagine being welcomed to the battlefield by the generals telling you that. And I mean, that was pretty extreme, you know. You didn't have Eisenhower saying anything like that. However, what you saw was a steady, through the wars, deterioration of respect and duties to the black soldier. In Vietnam, you saw the opposite. The charge was that, in World War II, the charge was these men aren't talented enough, strong enough, intelligent enough to even fire guns, even though most of them were rural Southern hunters who, like Henry Parham, were very good shots. The first hero of World War II at Pearl Harbor was one of the cooks, Dory Miller, who jumped behind a big anti-aircraft gun and took out 1, 2, or 3 Japanese planes, you know, depending on who's telling the story. And so in Vietnam, you know, that's not my war, but the charge was the opposite. And some veterans, Vietnam vets, have talked about this at my talks. The charge was that these men were used as cannon fodder and were put on the front lines. Latinos, blacks, Native Americans. So that was the charge in Vietnam. So it was a different thing. But if you talk to African Americans who served in Vietnam, and I've talked to many of them have come to my talks, they've said the stories that you're telling are very similar to what we went through, even though our units weren't segregated. So.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have left for questions, and I'd just like to make a quick announcement that Ms. Hervieux's book will be available for purchase at the back. Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you. Thank you very much.